Hello, this is Aaron. Welcome back to the show. Thank you all for joining. And today I am very pleased to be joined by Nate Fischer and Ben Dunson to talk about the new venture that we have launched called American Reformer, which is a new Protestant nonprofit that you will be learning much more about during the course of our conversation. So, Nate, Ben, thank you for joining, taking the time today.
Good to be here.
Thanks, Aaron.
I rather than me trying to do a bio, I thought I would just ask you to each maybe just say a few words about yourself, introduce yourself. So maybe Nate, you could just tell people a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So, Aaron, my background is really different than a lot of people who are focused in the Christian nonprofit, the evangelical nonprofit space. I'm coming out of business where I've been an investor. I went to law school with the intent of going into business, went straight into investing and started buying distressed real estate in 2011. So I guess jumping back a little bit further, I grew up in a Christian home. I grew up in upstate New York, was homeschooled during the very relatively early days of homeschooling. I was homeschooled all 12 years, grew up in the Christian Reformed Church, really great Christian family, great but very small church growing up. Went to Calvin College, now Calvin University, which is the denominational college of Calvin. And one that I have publicly written about since then, not in ways that align
Not
with
pleasing,
some of the...
not fondly in many respects.
No, and I think that in many ways, Calvin displays a lot of the trends that we are addressing in the Protestant and evangelical world more generally, kind of ahead of a lot of the other institutions. So I saw it even then, and I've really seen that trajectory continue in ways that I think would disturb many people. But I went there. My plan was always business. I went into investing really as a macro investor. So I bought distressed real estate in 2011, was in that for a few years. I was never focused on the real estate so much as I was focused on really the big macro trends driving some of these opportunities. Spent some time in technology. It was in San Francisco for 2 years, spent a year around the world in many different countries, really exploring opportunities. And then moved to Dallas 3 years ago. So I've been in Dallas 3 years ago. I got married. My wife was also at law school with me. We have 3 kids now, a 4th on the way in September.
Congratulations.
And thank you. And now we're homeschooling our kids. But especially recently have launched, or am in the process of launching, a number of ventures that have turned toward both the political, the media space, and really playing into a lot of the trends that we see changing politics and public discourse. And I think elevating the importance of politics. And I think that is, I'm coming at that in some ways as an investor, in some ways looking at this perspective of here's a paradigm shift coming that is not being addressed by legacy institutions. And I've seen as an investor how that can cause dislocations, how that can cause significant changes. And in this case, it aligns with something I consider a lot more important than just financial returns. So as an investor, it was really, how do I make a good trade? How do I do something that's going to be profitable? Now it touches things that I think are much more important to both the future of our country and the future of the church, which I'm ultimately are much more important. They're ones that are essential to my broader goals in life in many ways. And so I'm coming into this. I'm coming into something that I care more deeply about than I have historically about business, and where I'm actually looking to get more actively involved in hopefully changing the course of how this stuff develops versus just make a trade to try to sort of make the right trade and profit from it. So it's a change in perspective that has led to things like American Reformer, where we're actively seeking to influence the course, and broader media plays. And yet I'm coming from a perspective that I think is different than many people. So I hope that
Great.
is able to add to this.
Great. And by the way, so thanks for that. I'm hearing a little rattling on you, almost as if maybe you're bumping your microphone or something. So I don't know if you're using that thing, but if it gets you there, you can hit it. Ben, maybe you could just talk a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, great. So I am a New Testament scholar by trade. I have I've been through seminary, and then I have a PhD in New Testament. I've taught at a variety of Christian colleges and seminaries over the last decade, and I've very much enjoyed the teaching, but I, like Nate, am also very concerned with many trends in our broader culture, but also in the church. And in fact, with ways that Christians are very easily being just swayed by the culture rather than having the resources to kind of stand firm and resist that. So that's one of the reasons I've been so excited with this project. I'm a New Testament scholar, but I've always had a very strong interest in politics, statecraft, cultural issues and challenges. My PhD dissertation was on the individual and community in Romans, which is a topic that, apart from Romans, I think kind of crosses over so many different aspects of society, whether it's economics or politics. And so I've always kind of had these two kind of interests that go side by side, and I've tried to explore those throughout my career, and I just think they're very important. They're very vital issues that we have to deal with today, and provide a Christian perspective to those issues. I think that's very important. That's what gets me excited about this project. I'm married. I have 4 boys. Live in North Texas, and that's
thanks.
That's it.
Well, guys, thanks for sharing that. So just to let you know, Nate is the board chairman of American Reformer, and Ben is going to be the editor-in-chief of our publications. And so thank you for that. So I guess we'll talk a little bit about American Reformer and why we started it. So maybe, Nate, I just first ask you, like, what is American Reformer and the vision that you have for it? Hey, Nate, it actually, you're muted there on your end, or it doesn't work. We may have to plug your mic back in.
There we go.
Okay.
It unmuted me when I pulled out the microphone.
Okay, there you go.
Everything good now?
Yes.
Excellent. So my vision, as I alluded to, is to influence and change the direction of the church in ways that avert very destructive trends that I think we've seen multiple times. So I saw this course at Calvin, which is further along this trajectory than many of the institutions that are seen as evangelical today. But then you can look back and you see the trend of the mainline Protestant churches, many cases a century ago, in many cases more. And you've seen this story over and over again. You've seen distinctly Christian institutions abandon often abandon what makes them distinctly Christian, and they specifically abandon positions that are going to put them into conflict with society and with broader social trends. And so with American Reformer, my view is to have an influence there, and it's less about my sort of personal involvement in that influence. I'm going to be involved as the chairman, but Aaron and Ben are likely to be much more actively involved in actually shaping the content. For me, it's how do we organize resources? Again, I think a little bit of an investor. What are the points of leverage where we have the ability to really change the direction? And I think that the way I look at it is there's a big gap. There's a lot of ideas and concepts that are deeply rooted in the Protestant tradition that will resonate with a lot of people, that people are hungry for. And you can even see this, I think, in the extent to which you see evangelicals convert to Catholicism, for instance. You can see a lot of people who are leaving what they feel as increasingly often shallow traditions, and they're hungry for something that feels more rooted, that feels more confident in its claim to the truth. It's willing to assert, it believes something. And that's something that I think we've lost. So I think there's low-hanging fruit in terms of our ability to more confidently assert what we stand for and frame those in ways that are are effective. They're effective in the media that we choose to use, especially digital media like this, and that there's very high potential for just putting out those perspectives confidently, and in many cases framed in a way that will highlight contrasts with common errors, to quickly gain a lot of attention, to resonate with people who know that they know they're uncomfortable with where things are going. They know that they see certain people, especially certain people rising in evangelical institutions, doing things that really disturb them, and yet they haven't heard an alternative perspective clearly articulated. And by putting out that alternative perspective, there's the potential for really rapid resonance with people who are hungry for it, as well as the potential for appeal to a lot of people who may not even have ever really been within the evangelical world, partially because they haven't heard some of these positions as clearly articulated. So I think it has the ability to actually influence a lot of people who recognize there's something wrong with society and will be excited to hear the church actually confidently speak truth to society, and that truth will resonate with them. And then that might be a longer process of moving them. In many cases, they might be coming from further away, and that's really a process of teaching them a new perspective on many aspects of life, and then quick resonance with a lot of Christians who recognize that their institutions have drifted. So those would be my goals. It's to move people. It's not just to talk. I think there's a lot of media. You see this especially on the right. A lot of media has become obsessed with talking, with being clever, with attaining moral victories, owning the libs in certain spaces. A lot of that's about just feeling smart as the world falls apart, and I'm not interested in that. The goal is to do what we can to stop the world and especially the church from falling.
Yeah. And, I have a lot I could say on that, and I probably will. But first, I want to just get Ben, maybe your answer on that question, because the first project, if you will, that we're doing out of American Reformer is going to be an online publication or journal. And so, maybe you could talk a little bit about that, but also like why you think we need a new journal when there are so many sites out there already publishing. Why do we need yet another one? And what do you hope, what is your perspective on what to accomplish through it?
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Why another one? Because, many people know that there are a lot of things going wrong in the church and in our society, and those are occasionally addressed elsewhere in different places. One of the main distinctives for us is going to be to try to show people that there actually is a richer, deeper Protestant way of thinking about these things than maybe the typical evangelical approach, which tends to be when you're thinking about society and culture and especially politics. If you get involved in some way, you're going to dirty your hands. You're going to necessarily deviate from the gospel. Now, people become obsessed with politics, and that's all that matters to them, and it can be very unhealthy. But there's been this kind of reaction against getting engaged because we think that we're going to deviate from the mission of the church. And even almost to the point of telling people, like, you can't be involved, or if you're involved, you at least can't have a strong view that this candidate is actually better than this candidate, or this party is better than this party. It's almost like this sense that there has to be this neutrality when we come to these issues, as if that's the only way to be faithful as a Christian, is to just come at this with this total neutrality. I think really that's more influenced by just the last 100 years of American society, where without maybe even realizing it, we've just imbibed this general kind of classically liberal paradigm where neutrality is the one supreme virtue, and to take a strong stance for one party versus another is actually wrong, it's thought, from a Christian perspective. But it very well could be the case that you have two political parties. One party could believe almost everything that is diametrically opposed to Christian truth. One party, it's not equal with Scripture, it's not equal with God's view of everything, but most of what they believe could actually be consonant with Christian morality. I'm not saying that that's necessarily the case in our situation, but that at least is a possibility. I think for a lot of evangelicals, that's not even a possibility. It's that we just have to be neutral when we come to these things. And what we're trying to do is show them that there's a better way, that the way we'll do that is to try to put people in touch with a more classic Protestant approach to politics, to culture, even to questions of natural law. Like Nate said, a lot of times people start to gravitate towards Roman Catholicism precisely because they think they're the only ones who are seriously grappling with these things. And frankly, if you looked around in the evangelical world, you might actually be somewhat warranted in thinking that. They're the ones that are seriously thinking through those issues. They're thinking through natural law and what that means for our society. What has God revealed in the world about how the world works? What has he revealed about sexuality and political arrangements and things, just simply from how humans have studied these over time and have learned from successes and failures in the past, and things like that. And so we want to bring people into that discussion, and the goal is it's not just a kind of superficial, let's go back to the 16th century and pretend nothing has changed. Take a Protestant political point from the 16th century and just directly apply it to us today. Like in many ways, that wouldn't work because the situation has changed. We have to be sensitive to where we actually are today. And yet, there are all these great ideas in historical Protestantism that evangelicals tend to not be particularly aware of. One comes to mind just as an example to kind of illustrate this, and it's the political theory of the lesser magistrate. And that is simply that God has ordained many governing officials, and there's a hierarchy. And it doesn't actually matter what political form you're under. It could be monarchy, it could be dictatorship, it could be democracy. There's still going to be degrees of authority. And there are going to be times where the higher authority does something that is bad, it's wrong, it's unconstitutional, it's evil. And you wonder, what can you do about this as a Christian? Because you could turn to, say, Romans 13, and you could read that and think, okay, I have to submit myself to the governing authorities, therefore I have to go along with this no matter what. Right? Well, there's a long Protestant tradition of reflection on Romans 13 and on things like this, and it falls under the heading of the lesser magistrate. And what that means is that there are other God-ordained authorities underneath that magistrate who have been given a responsibility to govern well too, and we can appeal to them to actually resist those who are above them at times, if the situation is correct. Well, so that's an old theory, and it wouldn't make sense to try to apply that today in a just strictly one-on-one sense, perhaps. But we can already see this happening in certain places in America. We have a very strong system of governors across the country, which is very different than a lot of nations, where if the top official in that nation makes a decree or does something, it's really hard for anyone beneath them to resist it. But in America, governors still have a lot of authority, and they can do a lot of good. So I think of, and here's something too, just with our approach. I can name names. Ron DeSantis, okay, I can say, I actually think he's doing a good job with this. And is that a partisan thing for me to say? Well, perhaps, but it doesn't mean it's not actually a good thing to say. He is doing a lot of good as a governor, and I would even say resisting certain things that are happening elsewhere in the country. That's why a lot of people are fleeing from other states to Florida. And is he doing this because he's read classic Protestant lesser magistrate theory? I doubt it. But he still is essentially implementing that vision. Well, what does that mean then? I mean, for Christians, well, even if he's not doing it for that reason, it should be something that Christians get behind and support, I think. And they can actually have an impact, right, by supporting someone who's doing something good like that. and we'd have a good reason for doing that. Another example that comes to mind is John MacArthur's church in California. When and this is even more practical, I think, when the COVID restrictions were implemented in California, his church resisted that and said, we're not gonna do all this social distancing and wearing of the masks. Okay, that's a debatable question for Christians, but he got a lot of flack from evangelical commentators. They were saying, this is actually wrong of you. You're not submitting to the governing authorities. What you're doing is actually possibly even evil because for that very reason. And what happened? Well, the courts, the lesser magistrate, actually ruled in his favor. They said this is not constitutional. This is an infringement on the free exercise of religion. And the lesser magistrate ruled in favor of his church. And they actually said, you're right, this isn't constitutional. And what the governor has decreed is not constitutional, it's not allowable. So it actually turns out that they were the ones who were doing the right thing, according to even our own form of government. And they were the ones who were appealing to the lesser magistrate, and they were successful in that. That's very practical because a lot of Christians gave them a really hard time, even very strongly condemned them for that. If we can provide this perspective and say, no, there's actually a different way to think about this that's better. It's taking an old idea and it's trying to be sensitive to think about how it could be applied today.
That's a great example, Ben, because, that's not one that's not really one that I would call myself by an expertise on by any stretch of the imagination. My upbringing was maybe more in a fundamentalist world where it's like very, I guess the term is biblicist that I like to do. You read Romans 13 and what does it say? Oh, you gotta be in submission to the authorities. Well, what does that mean? Well, there's like essentially a massive Reformed tradition of how to think about that.
Yeah. That
is mostly absent from a lot of the discussions today where people are trying to just appeal directly to Scripture without talking about, what has our own tradition said about this for 400, 500 years?
Yeah. And it's pan-Protestant too. I mean, you've got very serious Anglican reflection on this in the past, Lutheran as well.
Yeah, I think I think that's a great example because so much of our own tradition, is not even known by people, in the kind of the evangelical world today. Whereas I think you're right, Nate, yet it is a little shallow. Myself, I look at this. There's so many things that I think of why we need this, and one of them is you both talk about this Catholicism thing. Is a lot of times conservative Christians, social conservatives, different people have, in essence, outsourced their thinking to the Catholics. I mean, certainly in political conservatism is very heavily Catholic dominated, and and some of them are like a lot of people have first things envy. Because they say, that's where all, that, why don't we have a publication? Why isn't there a Protestant First Things? I don't know how many times I've heard people say that. But I think there is this sense in which people have looked to Catholics to provide more intellectually sophisticated answers to questions when in fact there's quite a Protestant tradition to draw on that just isn't out there as much. And so I think that's kind of one is like, we have to stop outsourcing all of our thinking to Catholics. I think, a second one is for me, is the Protestant world seems to have a pretty narrow kind of Overton window of what you're allowed to talk about and not allowed to talk about. And I really saw this in terms of, my own work in the masculinist and talking about gender issues. And, if I wanted to critique some of the teaching around servant leaders, where they claim that servant leadership is what's attractive, I could come to them, I could have 50 or 100 studies out of psychology and sociology demonstrating what really drives attraction, which is no mystery and is well known. But there's probably no place I could have written about that. There's no institution that would be open to hearing anything contrary to the party line. I think a lot of evangelicalism has become tribal. There's these different tribes. There's not just one tribe, right? But there's different tribes, and these tribes sort of have party lines. And so this party line is kind of smothering debate in a lot of ways. And if you're kind of not going along to get along, you might find yourself totally out. I mean, you can even find yourself kind of blackballed. even kind of, you might call inner party members sometimes get suppressed. I mean, it was not long ago that Kevin DeYoung wrote something. I think it was a review of the book, this book on reparations. He wrote it for the Gospel Coalition. He's a council member there. He's on the board, and like, they didn't even really promote it. They didn't do anything with it, and it was sort of like, it was kind of like ignored. And then like a week later, he announces he's stepping down off their governing board, and I'm like, I don't know what happened there, but it seems a little odd timing. It's like even a guy like him, who's sort of a made man, can't even get his articles tweeted if he goes outside, he colors outside the lines. And so there is this sense in which we need to have, room for a more diverse set of voices and perspectives to be heard in some of these issues.
Yeah, that's good.
The other thing nothing I've ever written has resonated like this thing I wrote back in 2017 about, it was called The Lost World of American Evangelicalism. It was the three worlds, as I called it: the positive world, the neutral world, and the negative world. And that talks about how Christianity relates to the culture, or sees the culture relates to Christianity. So then the positive world, as I said, was pre-1994. In essence, people, the Christianity was seen as a social positive by the world. That's the era of the moral majority. And even if you could say they weren't a majority, they could at least plausibly claim to represent the majority in that era. And that was sort of maybe the religious right era. Then we move into what I call the neutral world, where Christianity is sort of a neutral element, maybe seen more like a personal affectation. Again, I always use the example, oh, you're a Christian? Great, I'm a vegan. Let's sit down, let's talk. Christianity is now kind of just, it's kind of a neutral attribute. And this is what I call the era of the cultural engagement. So that's where a lot of the urban, elite kind of people, wanted to engage. And then but now, I say 2014, nothing magical about the date. We've entered this negative world where Christianity is seen as, a social negative. To be known as a Christian actually hurts you socially in elite precincts of society. Christian morality is expressly rejected and seen as a threat to the new public moral order. And as we entered this world, these other worlds had these strategies. So you had like the religious right, culture war strategy, the positive world. You had this sort of cultural engagement, sort of Tim Keller type strategy in the neutral world. But what's the strategy for the negative world? And I've really seen that the evangelical world, the Protestant world, has not really sought to adapt to this negative world. And again, it's the former Catholic, now Orthodox Rod Dreher who was writing about it, the Benedict option, saying we need to have the Benedict option. Well, whether you agree with that or not, I think it was interesting that all the evangelicals sort of dumped on that. And they're like, no, we have to think about the Great Commission, all this. And, you start thinking about it, like, what does it mean, right, to, what does it mean to live in the negative world as a Protestant church? And that's like a brass tacks question, not just of ideas, but like, how should we actually live? What should we do? And to me, like, American Reformer is going to help fill that gap of just, helping educate people about this world. Like, how should we structure ourselves? How should we live in it? So I think it's really important that we have a new voice. Again, I mean, it's sort of like the masculinist. It would have been nice if I didn't have to start it, and I kind of started it because I felt like I had no choice because I'm like, a lot of this stuff is wrong, and I just wish one of these pastors would take this up so I don't have to, but they didn't. And so I think this is one where there is a gap in the market where people are not talking about the negative world. We're not talking about our own rich tradition. We're outsourcing to the Catholics. We do have a lot of people who are getting squishy, and there's a need for something more that's going to be bolder, but not just polemical, not just owning the libs, but is really going to be rich in our own tradition, and practically minded about what to do.
Yeah, and I think that the existence of a paradigm shift like that, as you described, is actually one of the strongest reasons that we need to return to first principles. In a sense, we need to return to some of this deep thinking. If you think of the Protestant Reformation, a lot of the thought that grew out of that, a lot of the political thought grew out of a time of a change. It was a fundamental paradigm shift in the nature of politics. The emergence of the nation state, the 30 Years' War, developed as a result of pretty radical changes in the world. And so we have thinkers addressing really, really deep questions that are fundamental questions that are going to be helpful as we return to a situation where there's a greater degree of uncertainty, where we face essentially a world that we're not as familiar with, where we don't have ready answers from the last 30 years to a lot of the questions we face. And so it's natural to go back, I think, in that situation. And it's natural to look at a time when the world was in turmoil, and it's helpful to see the answers that people had in that circumstance to many, many aspects of life. And I really like the way the masculinist approached this. It was very much focused on a lot of it is addressing how to build an anti-fragile life, a life that is going to be prepared for a world where there's a higher degree of uncertainty and possibly negative and destructive forces. And I think the church needs to make some of those similar changes.
Now, I'll just say, some of you are out there watching live. I see people making comments. Thanks for that. I'm going to ask some questions of these guys and keep the conversation going. But I want to invite anyone who is watching live, if you want to throw a question in the comments of the stream, we'll potentially take some questions from the audience, so to speak, if you have anything you'd like to talk about. One thing that really, has really struck me is we're in this sort of, you mentioned that the world is sort of changing, and there's really a disintegration of some of the old alignments, a lot of the old strategies, a lot of the old thinking. It just isn't working anymore. And one of the things that we have that has really puzzled me is this sort of big division between, you might call the elite or the establishment, and the base. And so we saw this in Republican politics with Donald Trump. By and large, all of the elite Republican types, the elite conservatives, they hated Trump. They became the never Trumps. I mean, I worked for a conservative think tank where essentially almost no one supported him there in 2016. And it was kind of like probably more people voted for Hillary than voted for Trump. And, and so you saw this guy, Trump, who was a lot of excitement from sort of the grassroots voters, but sort of horror from kind of the establishment of society. And that split has been mirrored, I think, into the church as well. Some of it directly over politics, in that, 80% of, evangelicals voted for Trump, probably the 20% that didn't were most of the elites. There were a lot of these never Trumps. And so now you got this weird situation where the elites, or supposedly the leaders of the evangelical world, often seem to hate the very people they're supposed to be leading. I mean, I think of just the way that David French talks about things, for example, or people talking about, I'm celebrating the end of Bible Belt Christianity. Isn't it great that Bible Belt Christianity is going away? What is causing that? Kind of almost hostility to the people in the pews by some of these leaders.
Nate, do you want to tackle that one?
So I have theories, and I think it's broad. I think cases like French are an extreme one. I would say French has really become consumed with a level of bitterness that is driving attacks and real hostility and real bitterness at, I think, the base having gone in a different direction. I think other people, it's not necessarily as much a personal hostility as it's a class issue. And I see this at times a lot of, and maybe it goes to the nature of how evangelicals pick our elites. I think in many cases we outsource an element of credentialing to elite secular institutions, let's say Ivy League schools, and even elite publications. Getting published in the New York Times, getting published in the Atlantic is something that helps your rise as an evangelical influencer, even within the church. It probably increases your chance of being elevated to a leadership position in the denomination or in a seminary. And that's a real challenge because those institutions fundamentally oppose us on all of our values. Ultimately, the church is going to be hated by the world. And yet, to the extent that we outsource a significant amount of our credentialing to those institutions, we're going to tend to elevate an elite that is framing Christianity in a way that is more appealing to the world. And I don't think this needs to reflect anything negative about the person himself. It may reflect no malice at all. And I think this is important to emphasize. So I think in the case of French, I think there very obviously is an element of personal malice. But even if someone's entirely well-meaning, the world is going to do their part. An elite publication is going to do its part to elevate someone whose entirely sincere vision of Christianity is convenient to their interests. So I see a lot of this. I guess you can see an element of this in sort of what I call almost a pretextual Anabaptist view of politics, which is people who are going to make. We talked about this sort of above it all in politics, not going to take a side. There's a lot of people who have very sincere beliefs in why it's almost a pietistic view, I guess, why we should be above it all. Those people are preaching a message that's very convenient to political opponents who want evangelicals to stay out of politics. So those people are going to be elevated. And as a result, we're going to, and you see this in other areas too. I think Keller sort of has a perspective where he'll affirm the Orthodox Christian perspective, but he'll criticize churches for their own purportedly bad behavior on some of these matters, even more harshly than he'll criticize people who are diverging from the traditionally Christian perspective. And he may sincerely believe that we should be taking the log out of our own eye, but it's very convenient for the world to have a set of Christian elites who are always going to turn around and criticize the church more harshly, no matter what the issue is. And so I think that you're going to see this sort of group of elites who are elevated, who end up sharing a lot, and in many cases even owing their position to our secular and social elites who come from a very different class perspective. And an easy way for them to maintain their alignment with that group of people is to take any easy opportunity to distance themselves from the base that is really despised by the world. So if you're in New York and your sort of elite circles really, really dislike the evangelical base, then it's easy to just want to talk about. And it's just the goal is to be agreeable. You'll just want to talk about ways that you can sort of emphasize that they are wrong about this. You don't have to be harsh like these people. You don't have to be mean like these people. You don't have to be as ignorant about racism as these people are, as a way almost to try to be welcoming to the people you're around, I think is how many of them think about it, to be as charitable as possible. But you end up with a discourse that is radically different in its focus, and it's been shaped by who our evangelical elites are ultimately looking to please and are looking to appeal to, and in many cases even owe elements of their career success to. So that would be a hypothesis here. I think it's a very complicated dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, there is something to this kind of credentialing, I think, and and I've taken advantage of it myself. I don't have the fancy degrees, but when I started the Masculinist, I was working for the Manhattan Institute, and I'd been published in a lot. I've been published in the Atlantic. I've been published in the Washington Post. I've been published in the New York Times. I've been in all the same publications they've been in, and I really do think that played a role in people like taking seriously what you do when you're started. Right? If somebody hadn't been able to like go to my personal website and like click on my press page and see that, they probably would have taken me. I would have been taken probably less seriously. So I probably benefited from some of that yourself. And I don't think there's anything wrong with being in those publications. I don't think it's as impressive as having had it, it's like that and 50 cents will get you a cup of coffee. But they do have a great platform. There's nothing wrong with writing for them. I would happily write for some of them again in the future. But you're right, they know how to dangle the trinket. They know how to dangle the trinket, and especially if you're like a conservative, there's always like a New York Times op-ed slot waiting for you if you're ready to bash conservatives. I'm the lifelong Republican who's turned on my party because they finally went too far. That class is. So you also have to think. I think you have to think about the venue when you make some of these statements, and so they're able to. They're very good at like getting people to come along on their line, and I really thought it was interesting that you say he's changed it. But the new CEO of Christianity Today, Timothy Dalrymple, his Twitter profile used to highlight that he went to both Harvard and Stanford. And I just thought that was like, there's something about like your 140 character Twitter bio or whatever. You have to mention like the 2 elite schools you went to. I do think there is sort of a credential envy that some of these people have. They don't, and I said this about the neutral world, the positive world people. They tended to be kind of backwater, a little more low status. The neutral world people, they're in New York. They want to be higher status. And, people always ask me, why did you pick 1994 as the year for the start of the neutral world? And there's nothing magical about that. But that is the year that Giuliani became mayor. And when, he broke the back of crime in New York and the cities came back and they became very attractive places to live. And now all of a sudden you have a lot of Christian elites living in the urban centers. It really changes the whole perspective on how you think about the world and who your peer set is and who you're trying to impress.
I'll just jump in, and I see a question from Lance about why do we owe unbelievers maximum agreeability, and I think that also goes to that goes to a theme here, which is it's a driving rule, and Aaron's written about that. You've written about this. A driving principle is niceness, I think, in a lot of elite circles, both elite conservative, elite Republican, and elite Christian circles. And what's interesting is I don't see a lot of biblical precedent for this. There are certainly admonitions at times, but I think it's not nearly the level that it seems to be elevated to as a rule in the church. And even very, very well-meaning, even very sincere believers are, I think they feel very constrained by anything that feels like it's not nice. And the example of Jesus was oftentimes very far from this. He had very harsh words at times for his enemies, extremely harsh. He would mock them. Elijah mocked the prophets of Baal before he slaughtered them. It was... there's a lot of different ways that the truth has been presented and that lies have been confronted in the Bible. And I think there's an element to which a lot of what we see in the church and in, I think, American traditional elite society, as I think Aaron's touched on in some of his pieces, some of his podcasts, is much more of a product of maybe Victorian norms or social norms that grew out of a particular society that have been conflated with absolute truths rather than reflecting timeless Christian principles. And they might be good things. They might be good products of a society that was influenced by Christianity, but they were products of a society that was shaped in many, many ways, reflecting a broader time and place that allowed those norms to be normalized. And I think if Christians feel constrained by those, that can limit our ability to boldly proclaim the truth, which is very much a command in Scripture.
Yeah.
Oh, I could maybe just jump in there because I've seen this same dynamic in the academic world, and I don't say this because I have many friends that have prestigious degrees, and it's not that their degrees are worthless or anything like that. It's just that it is absolutely the case. If you have a PhD from Harvard or from Oxford or from Yale or wherever, evangelical colleges and seminaries are going to be very eager to snag you for a teaching position. And that may not be a bad thing, but there is that subtle danger, subtle temptation to elevate that above all else and to see the credential as the thing that will gain institutional credibility and all of that. And it comes with baggage. I've seen this time and time again, that the subtle temptation to be respected by the broader culture has devastated the church. I think you can see this throughout the entire history of the church. It's really never been any different. It's just that desire to be respected is a very subtle temptation that leads people to back away from certain truths that won't gain them respect, and then to kind of camp out on things that will gain them a hearing in the world. And a lot of times I think Christians don't even know they're doing it, because it is a very subtle temptation. And it's just the fact, we don't like to be disliked, do we? Who likes people to hate them and to mock them and to revile them and to dislike them? But that's exactly what Christ calls us to as Christians, is to be prepared to be reviled by the world, because the world is hostile to the gospel, it's hostile to the truth. And that's never going to change. Those who are unbelieving and are outside of Christ are necessarily hostile to the truth, because they don't know the truth. And we can't ever be winsome enough to change that dynamic of unbelief and unbelieving hostility toward the truth. It's always going to exist, and so there's a temptation for us then to soften the truth and to back away from controversial truths.
Yeah. Now, what I would say is I do think there's sort of an opposite scenario that did kind of rule in this religious right era, where you had some people, maybe like Pat Robertson, who built a business off saying things they knew would offend the world, generate a lot of controversy, you fundraise off of it. So essentially, one of my rules is like, don't voluntarily play the heel, right? There's always this, the world out there has got a script already written with a bad guy role written. And there's, you could have a nice career playing the bad guy, right? And, even some of these like super crazy people out there, like Richard Spencer, he knows how to play the bad guy role, so he gets on CNN. And so I don't think we need to be like gratuitously try to offend people in order to like prove how we are. But then, we don't want to go to the other extreme either. So, I'm always a little skeptical of third way sometimes, but I think we have to be ready to be disliked, and we can't allow being liked to shape our, decisions to an excessive dissent. But we also, we shouldn't directly go seek. It's like the church say, don't seek out martyrdom. Martyrdom may come for you, but the people who are going to seek it out, that's not necessarily a good thing either. So I think there is a sense in which we have to be careful to avoid both extremes on that. And let's be serious, let's be bold and confident, and we'll get enough hate just by being that, without trying to, play the role that's going to like generate the most clicks or something like that.
Yeah, a confident statement of Christian truth is always going to be offensive to the world. So we're not going to have to try to offend. It's necessarily going to happen.
Well, and I think a relevant point here is playing the pre-written role of bad guy is actually it's a position that still lets them write the script, and it's actually a much less effective position, because you aren't saying the truth that you want to say. You might be saying the truth, but you're talking about the topics that they want you to talk about. And you want to be talking about the topics that are most effective to communicate what you believe matters in that time and place. And so I think independence is the way you have an impact, a disproportionate impact in anything. And this is a topic that you've seen talked about a lot in the investment world. Thiel's talked about this very effectively. If a business is not built on an independent perspective, then you're just kind of competing in a domain that leads to ultimately being squeezed out. And if we are reactive, we are we're still letting them dictate what we talk about, and that's never going to be a winning strategy. I think you saw this very much with Jesus, actually, where time and again people would come to Jesus, and Jesus didn't just tell them the truth. Jesus told them what he wanted. He talked about what he wanted to talk about, and often that meant a level of verbal judo to refuse to even engage them on a topic that he felt was unhelpful. He could have easily just stated the truth. I think there's a tendency in much more intellectual circles to immediately want to trot out the rational answer to what they said. But that's not the rhetorically effective strategy in many cases. The rhetorically effective strategy is to steer the conversation back to what you want to be talking about. Someone who recently was very good at this was Trump. He knew how to make people talk about what he wanted to talk about in a way that radically departed from, I think, a lot of what we've seen. I think that's not necessarily a model in every way how it was done, but it was very effective, I think, at in many ways driving some of these paradigm shifts in the nature of political dialogue, because it forced conversations about things that for a long time our elites had really gone to great lengths to avoid talking about. I think as Christians, we have ample opportunity to do the same thing in numerous areas where society is experiencing collapse, real turmoil, and Christians actually have a bold and a distinct perspective. So I think a good example I sometimes use is actually the Me Too movement. And it was really somewhat surprising to me how during the Me Too movement, so many in the church sort of rushed to say, yes, we endorse this movement. Harassment's bad. This is not Christian. We need to get our own people in line. When really, I think that was talking about it within the framework they wanted, which was all about sort of consent as the ultimate driver of whether sex is okay. And we just played into that sort of consent and power relationship. It's hard to imagine to me a better opportunity to jump out of their paradigm and say, well, what do you think is going to happen when you abandon, when you wholesale abandon a proper sexual ethic and embrace just a fundamentally flawed view of sex? Guess what? We have an answer, and it doesn't look anything like the position you're talking about. But I was surprised at how few Christians seemed to really try to use that jumping off point to pivot to what we wanted to talk about, and instead just added their 2 cents in the framework that was presented by the media. And I think there's just endless opportunities to do that. You look at Jesus's interactions in the Gospels, and it's full of using their question as a jumping off point to pivot to something completely different, and doing so with really great rhetorical skill, not just sort of rational ability.
You can think about sexuality too. I mean, today where on issues of homosexuality or transgenderism, and everyone comes at Christians and they say you're all a bunch of bigots, and then we spend all of our time trying to prove to them that we're not really bigots and we don't really hate people, et cetera, rather than talking about, like Nate said, a Christian sexual ethic and how it's good for people, how the family as God has ordained it is good, and how sex within marriage, the way God has ordained it, is good. So we spend all our energy to say we're not really bad people, rather than we actually know the truth and we have a better way.
One of the things that, you guys each have on AmericanReformer.org, you can go there and please do visit the site. And it's just a splash page now, but you can sign up for our list so that you'll get notified as soon as all the content is launching. We're planning to launch it in mid-July. And there are also some letters up there, founders letters, one from Nate and one from Ben. And Ben, your letter, you noted that everybody sees and complains. And Nate was talking about this, the disintegration of society around us, the opioid deaths, the out of wedlock births, the communities, many of the communities not in good shape. We see all these problems, rampant pornography use, out there, super hardcore porn on all these sites on your phones. And yet you talk to the Christians, leaders today is like, if you say, okay, great, we're going to do something about that. We're going to go out there and like try to stamp out porn. They seem to be horrified by any attempt to actually do anything about some of these problems.
Yeah.
What were you getting at when you started writing about that? What do you think we ought to be doing?
Well, maybe I'll just use that as an example. This is an instance where sometimes we can be so wedded to the paradigm of classical liberalism, and by that I'm just talking about the way sort of American political thinking developed, especially in the 19th century, to where neutrality is the role of the government, and that's it. It's almost such a part of our thinking that it's just the air that we breathe, and we can hardly even as Christians, think that there could be an alternative. So what if whoever is president says, we're just going to make pornography illegal, and you will not be able to access it, and we're gonna make stiff fines for anyone who produces it, and so on. Yeah, I do think a lot of Christians would actually be maybe not horrified, maybe they would be upset, because they'd say, no, the government can't do that. It's not being neutral. It's taking sides on a moral issue. Maybe there are problems that I can't foresee in an outright ban of pornography, but I can't think of any. And I actually, if you look back at kind of classic Christian reflection on the government, it's the role of the government, and this is explicitly stated in Romans 13, ironically, in that text that people always go to say, just do what the government says. Well, the government is supposed to be an agent for good. The state is supposed to promote what is good and to suppress what is evil. At the very least, what would happen if they did that with pornography and they just banned it outright? Right? I would say that's a very good thing. But many people would think, well, that's not how things happen in America. The government's just supposed to be neutral. And Christians would just jump on that and say, no, we can't do that. So, yeah, that's the kind of thing we want to get people thinking about, is there are other ways to think about these issues, and better ways even, that involve action, right? Where the government actually could do this, right? The church cannot, and it's not even called to transform culture, right? The church is called to preach the gospel, to administer the sacraments, to discipline its members, and so on. The church, as an institution, cannot go out there and transform the culture, but the state can. The state actually has that power and has that ability, and it could actually do good. People would potentially disagree with this, but in various countries today, in Eastern Europe, for example, they are putting in place policies to where social media companies are not allowed to restrict speech that is legal. Okay, so we could quibble about that. We could debate that. That's fine. The reason is that they recognize that social media companies are really policing speech only of one side, one persuasion, views that are on the right. And they're saying this is not healthy for society. We're not going to allow this. And so they step in and they fine them very heavily if they ban speech that is legal. Okay, whatever you want to say about that, they're taking action to try to address a societal issue. And so that's one of the things we want to get Christians thinking about is, I know it's ironic. We're sitting here having a long conversation about all of this. We're going to be writing about all of this. And we say, enough talk, right? Well, we're doing a lot of talk, right? But the talk is always oriented towards action. That's going to be one of our defining features, is that we're actually trying to help Christians think through concrete ways in which we could actually strive for a better world. And we know we're not going to bring in the new creation and utopia before Christ comes back, but we still, as Christians, have a responsibility to love our neighbor, and we want to see a better world. And that means action, not just words.
Yeah, it's interesting. Nate and I were talking about this. In the UK, they actually passed a law that all internet service providers have to block porn by default, and you have to opt in to get porn. So they didn't ban porn, but if you want to get porn, you have to opt in. I don't have a problem with requiring an opt-in. Why do you have to opt out of porn instead of opting into porn?
Yeah.
You were going to say
No,
something,
exactly.
Nate?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think you look at what would be considered radical today. And another example is no fault divorce. When's the last time you saw an article in a mainstream Christian evangelical publication questioning whether we should allow no fault divorce? That I can't think of one. It seems like that would be considered outside the Overton window. Whether we should take a more conciliatory approach toward gay marriage would be inside the Overton window. Maybe the government should steer clear of, take a neutral position in marriage, right? That's something that you might see discussed in Christian publications. But eliminating no fault divorce, I haven't seen that. And yet you think of the catastrophic damage that divorce has done to society, and how radically new of a policy it is throughout all of human history. Throughout nearly all of human history, marriage was a more significant, especially the history of Christendom. Marriage was a far more significant, far more legally meaningful institution. And really within the last, say, 50 to 60 years, we made a policy change that has resulted in, as we've seen, it's been followed by this massive decline, massive breakdown of marriages, massive decline in its meaning as an institution. And yet we don't even see discussion of whether that's something that we should legally reconsider. This weird little recent anomaly. And I think that tells you just how constrained the political discourse is in the Christian world. And we understand the significance of this institution. Jesus spoke directly to it, and yet it's still not even talked about. So I think that there's room for a much broader range of discussion of things that are so far from unprecedented. It's not even it's almost baffling that they're not currently discussed. And people would, I think a lot of people would say it's not possible. There's no way we're going to get the will to change that. Well, part of the nature of a paradigm shift is things can change far faster and far more than I think many people could easily predict. So if we're not even talking about it, if we're not even advocating for it, of course it's not going to happen. But the number of people who have been touched and hurt by things like divorce vastly exceeds anyone who I think would maybe feel a tangible personal interest in something like gay marriage. So it actually seems plausible to me that would be an easier issue to win on, to really rally a large share of the population. But that's sort of beside the point. The point is, we don't know what can happen. We should be expecting that there can be much more radical changes than I think most people would be able to foresee in politics. And it's given that, it's crazy for us not to be at least putting forth arguments for substantive, really meaningful substantive policy ideas that would address social ills, where we as Christians understand something about where things should go to solve this.
Yeah, the divorce one's interesting. Most of these changes that have come about through sort of leftist activism, when the people who came up with those ideas or started promoting them they were ludicrous. They would have been considered so ludicrous that but yet they started anyway. And so I think there's a sense that if you're not willing to push something when it's totally inconceivable that it would ever happen, you'll never get to the point where it is conceivable. Or even something like the Brexit movement, which I think goes back to the 1990s, when people started saying, we got to get out of this EU. And it was a fringe movement, but wouldn't you know it, today, they're out of the EU. So if we don't have the idea that we're starting with something, maybe we're starting with something that's way out of favor, like eliminating no-fault divorce, which I would certainly support that. And maybe it doesn't even occur in our lifetimes. But if we don't start the process of moving the ball down the field, it's never going to get there. If we're only waiting, and that's what I say. I think that the church has become very captive to some kind of incrementalism as well. And in this world, we have to think very differently. We have to think very differently. There's a point about how do we live practically in the world that we're in, but then what should we be working towards? And I think something like rethinking rethinking no fault divorce is one that I think is a good one.
Well, think of William Wilberforce. I know that's it's always the Christian example, but I mean that's exactly what people were telling him. This is impossible. There's no way this could ever happen, and within his own lifetime, it did. So, yeah, I think you're exactly right.
Now, two of the issues that are really causing tremendous dissension in churches today, and have even caused churches to split. There's real people are leaving churches, switching churches, all this. One has been masks and all that, and I think that issue is about to sort of go away because masks are sort of not required anymore. And the other one is sort of this, kind of rise of woke teachings on race, which have taken over. I mean, almost everything in society has become, saturated with race is all is race, and it's another one of these. It's another one of these things where most of the institutions have just totally embraced this, and the opposition to it. They seem, if you look at the polling, on a lot of these things, they're not very popular even among minorities, and yet every institution, every leadership is totally backing this stuff, and. Why is the church gone along with what are essentially secular teachings on a lot of things on the race issue, particularly when we actually have a lot of kind of internal things that we could have drawn on, to talk about it. Where did this woke thing come from, and how does this? And I guess just any general thoughts you have on it.
I mean, isn't it again? I don't say this because Christians shouldn't be thinking very seriously about race. I mean, Aaron, you've brought this up recently in a variety of venues, and I think you're exactly right. But race is the unavoidable cultural issue right now, and everywhere you turn in our culture, you're being bombarded with this message. And talk about an example of something changing overnight. Right, we went from discourse in which it would have been considered fringe to say that all white people are guilty of white supremacy and are guilty of whiteness, and even using that language. It seemed like almost overnight we went from that being a fringe idea to being essentially talk about, and so that's going to exert extreme pressure on leaders of Christian institutions and Christians in general to conform, because now if you question the theory of whiteness, you're actually probably a racist, right? And what is the worst thing you could be today? It's a racist, I guess, a homophobe. Yes, we should think seriously about race and about racial issues, but there's going to be that pressure to conform for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just struck this thing. When I first started noticing this, maybe 5-7 years ago, I'm like, these guys have essentially just adopted a language about race. It's entirely secular in origin. There's no, I mean, I even noticed, like, I did a little research project back in 2018. I said, hey, I noticed that they never seem to mention any scriptures on the Gospel Coalition when they mention race. I'm like, so I pulled all the articles that mentioned race, and like almost, like something like 40% of them had like no scriptures, and like another 20-something% of them had one. And often, and it's just amazing to me that something that literally has zero Christian origin to it has essentially totally taken over the discourse inside the church, and now everybody's just basically sounding like Robin DiAngelo or whatever, and they barely even appeal to scripture. It seems like in many cases, it's pretty wild. It just shows to me that how the fads just people are just blown here and there by the wind, by fads. And again, I don't know what you guys think of John Perkins, but like the work that John Perkins and them did through CCDA and a lot of things like that, that had like a real Christian, I think, rooting and real Christian origin to it. And I'm like, we had people who'd actually been thinking about this from an actual Christian perspective. That simply, why don't we look into some of our own resources? And it's like, no, let's look up what Ibram Kendi has to be saying. It's kind of weird to me.
Yeah,
I think it goes to that earlier point, which is they force us to what they want us to talk about. And I think the issue of race and racism is an effective one for them to co-opt the church. It's a more effective one than sexuality, because the problem is if we talk about sexuality, fundamentally the church is much more constrained in terms of what a Orthodox Christian can say about that. You can kind of downplay it. You can do some of what, say, Keller does, which is turn the mirror on how people how the church has behaved and maybe their own failings. But there's sort of pretty clear limits that I think most Christians will accept. And the beauty of race for them is it's one where we can all agree that racism's bad, but in their view of the world, it's some uniquely bad sin that is just this sort of new original sin. And they don't need us to explicitly admit that. If they just have us talk about it all the time, then it's going to take on, we all agree it's bad. So if we talk about it all the time, then we're going to be constantly denouncing it and condemning it as Orthodox Christians. And the problem is that fully plays into the narrative that they're pushing, which is that it's some uniquely bad sin. And as you say, doesn't even talk about scripture. Well, you don't need scripture to talk about a lot of things, but you should start to worry if all you're doing is talking about things that are even peripheral to what scripture talks about and fully aligned with what the world wants you to talk about. But it's a reflection of rhetorical savvy. And I think that's where we need to, that's where instead of being reactive, we really need to be proactive about forcing the world to talk about the things that we want them to talk about. There's a lot of things that are very uncomfortable. They're very, very uncomfortable for people on the other side to talk about, because they're issues where they have had catastrophic failures, where their views are clearly and often apparently directly leading into a lot of pain that a lot of people have suffered. And the church actually has really good answers on that. And if we force them to talk about those things, then we're going to come out, the church is going to come out looking strong, and the secular position is vulnerable. And so it's a matter of, I think it's a matter of rhetorical savvy, of a great deal of strategy that goes into that. And then part of it is just a willingness to boldly go out and say the sorts of things that demand a response when we have the opportunity. And the internet, as much as historically the TV networks and such have been gatekeepers that have been able to really control what people to talk about, I think if there's one very obvious change as we evolve into a digital era, it's that those gatekeepers are losing their power. So as much as they're flexing their power in many ways, demanding things like social media censorship, in practice, I think a lot of that's a losing battle. And really that's sort of flailing against a world where increasingly, and you see this actually was really interesting with Chris Rufo, for instance. Chris Rufo has been able to gain tremendous attention, largely operating independently, talking about what he wants to talk about. And you've seen his hit pieces against him, which have very quickly fallen apart. And it just shows really one man with a lot of energy, going out and critiquing something that's very vulnerable is able to gain national attention around that issue. And really, James Lindsay and Chris Rufo are two people who have been just incredibly forceful people in attacking this. But there's a lot, and that's one that I think we would fully align with their critiques. But there's a lot of issues where Christians could force a talk about this. I think the no-fault divorce one is a really, really interesting one. We might not win that issue immediately, but if we just force people to talk about, is no-fault divorce a good thing? I'm not saying that's necessarily the right strategic framing, but that seems like a topic where there's a lot of vulnerability on the other side. And it doesn't, as we've seen, it doesn't take that many people to force a discussion around an issue like that.
Yep. No, I agree. And, I agree. I think the fact that censorship is happening shows that the gatekeeping isn't working. If the gatekeeping was working, they wouldn't have to resort to naked censorship. So, I think we should wrap up here pretty soon. But Ben, but before we go, I would love to just ask. You have a few things in the hopper. Articles and topics that we might be publishing. You want to give people a little bit of a preview of coming attractions?
Right. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Yeah, I've got one that I've been working on the culture war. You often read that Christians should not be fighting the culture war. Or that we're the instigators of the culture war, or whatever. I'm going to argue that we should fight the culture war because it actually has spiritual implications. And what I mean by that is, to a certain degree, when the culture degenerates, it actually makes it much harder for Christians to be faithful. Even though that's just one of my points, is that this isn't actually just this isn't about trying to gain earthly power for ourselves just so we can dominate over other people or things like that. But there actually is a legitimate role for the state to play in making the world a better place. Christians should support that because that has implications for the life of the church, even for how we strive to be faithful. Pornography would be the chief example, I think. Just imagine how much easier it would be. So Christian sanctification is always hard. It's just hard because we're fighting against our own flesh. But just imagine if we didn't have to deal with pornography. Just imagine a world in which that wasn't the case, which it's ravaging the church. And just imagine if that wasn't the case. Does that mean that sexual lust is going to disappear? No. Does that mean that we're not going to have to fight against our flesh? No. But just imagine what that would do for Christians trying to be faithful in the world, and that's considered a culture war issue. But I don't think it can be left just in that realm. And I think there's actually some biblical support for this as well. So that's the kind of thing I'm going to be arguing. I've got probably a list of about 40 things right now in the hopper that I want to work on. But it kind of gives you a flavor for some of the directions I'm thinking of going.
Yeah, well, I'm very excited about this. Although we were kicking around the idea of how we wanted to frame it, I think, one of the ways that we did was this sort of like the intellectual and sort of high cultural orientation of a First Things, maybe the more popular culture, writing about kind of topical pieces of, the Gospel Coalition, and then maybe the more aggressive political approach of the American Mind. And somewhere in the intersection of all of that is where we're hoping to be, and so I'm looking forward to seeing what it is. So again, thank you guys for taking the time to join today. Again, for those of you who are out there listening, it's AmericanReformer.org. Get on the list. We'll be launching in mid-July, and sign up because you'll want to get notified when the content starts going out. And I'll also be plugging it regularly in the Masculinist. So again, gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thanks, Aaron.